So I'm not really too sure how this video is going to do because I've never really done anything related to The Walking Dead on this channel before, so not really sure if anybody who watches any of my videos is a fan of it, but I am a big fan of The Walking Dead franchise. The main show is one of my favourite shows of all time, and while I do have some serious issues with certain seasons of the show, overall I legitimately think most of the first 6 seasons are among the most fun I've ever had watching a show. Like, some of my memories of seeing parts of season 4 and season 5 for the first time are there as some of the best TV watching experiences I've had, and for the spin-offs I've kind of been a little hit or miss depending on them. Like Fear the Walking Dead season 1 and season 2 I think are cool mostly, but I'll never shut up about season 3. I think it's easily one of the best seasons of the entire franchise, and I also think season 6 is surprisingly really interesting. But then there's a completely other half of the show, like season 4, season 5, season 7 and season 8, that I think are easily in what I feel to be some of the biggest quality drop-offs I've ever experienced in a television show. Like, the drop-off there is the equivalent of the later seasons of The Flash in my opinion. Tales of the Walking Dead I was sort of whatever about. World Beyond I felt was kind of bad, then good, then bad, then good for a duration of the 2 seasons, a lot of back and forth there. Dead City and Daryl Dixon I have been a fan of. I think that they've both been pretty cool, and a lot of people have said online over the past few years that there are far too many The Walking Dead shows and that the story should have ended 10 years ago and all that sort of stuff, but I'm firmly of the mind that there's nothing bad about wanting there to be expansions to really popular universes and franchise. I think there's no reason why The Walking Dead completely needs to go away, because it is a big show, it's a big franchise. That said, ending the main show and then spinning off 6 of its main characters into 3 separate shows does make you feel like maybe the main show didn't need to end, but that's a different conversation. Anyway, that was a long intro. The Ones Who Live just released its first episode, which is the long-awaited return of Rick Grimes, who we last saw in 2018, and Michonne, who we last saw in 2020, so it's been a minute for both. And we've been waiting for this since literally the night of Rick's final episode, when they announced we were getting a whole trilogy of films based on what happened to him and where he is, and then they kind of entered development hell. We were really worried the whole thing was scrapped completely, and then we got a show which, in my opinion, is better. I think TV shows are always much better for things like this, for telling character stories. But I'm going to be very light on spoilers because this did literally just release, but general feelings is that I really liked it. I think I liked the first episode of this more than any episode of Dead City or Daryl Dixon, and I did like most of the episodes from those shows. There is a pretty instant feeling that The Ones Who Live, when you're watching this first episode, is that they put a lot of their effort into this show. Like, there's a real feeling of a push behind it for both AMC and the cast. The things like Fear the Walking Dead's last season, which came out late last year, didn't really get or didn't really have. Feels like a lot more marketing was put into this and they want a lot more people watching this show than they might have done with Fear the Walking Dead, which kind of sucks for that show, but whatever. The first episode, though, of The Ones Who Live, it spends most of its time focused completely on Rick and what has been going on with him since the CRM picked him up. And it's been very, very much focused on Rick's mental space, on how everything has been really, really messing him up. Like, there are some very dark scenes where we see how low he is at, and it was a really welcome way to start this show off, because that was one of the main things I was wondering, like, what is Rick like currently? And the opening scene is exactly this. It's Andrew Lincoln not speaking, we just see his face, we see his reactions, and you instantly can see that this is a Rick very reminiscent of like the Negan years in the main show, a Rick that is feeling and looking broken in a way that we're not usually used to seeing with the character. One thing I was a little disappointed about is that the show instantly jumps to 5 years in with Rick, so we kind of completely skip over the first 5 years of him being gone from The Walking Dead, and we pretty much start from where the time jump starts in the main show, when we first cut to showing like a grown-up Judith and the new characters in the main show. That's pretty much the same as when we catch up with Rick, and then we follow him all the way to present day for The Walking Dead. Now, I do get why they did this. There is about 10 years of time from when we first see Rick and when he first leaves the main show, and when the most recent thing in the main show happened. That's a long time to cover, and if they tried to do all of this in this episode, it would be about 3 times as long. But I was kind of hoping we'd see some of the first interactions between Rick and these people, how he comes to terms with the fact that he's not getting out of here, maybe even some kind of parallel to when he first woke up in the hospital in the main show. But this still really works well for the story, because instead of seeing any of that, we're just straight away dropped into this new world with a ton of new characters who have established relationships with Rick. We're just kind of left to figure it all out, which does really work. Mostly the new characters are great. We don't get to see overly much of any of them, but what we do see leaves you wanting more. There wasn't really any of the new cast that had me not enjoying a scene they were in, which honestly in general, props to the show, because I don't think a single scene had me bored or uninvested. Speaking of things that I think the show did well, they really did a good job at explaining why Rick hasn't been back in the main show, because that was one thing I remember a lot of people was really worried about, were like, how are they going to explain why Rick hasn't come back after 6 to 10 years away? Like, that doesn't make sense for the Rick we know. They do a really good job at kind of telling you why that has happened. One thing I did notice was a little much were some of the moments of exposition, because obviously given how much time has passed, we have a lot of characters giving very, very heavy monologues and dialogue pieces about what has happened with them in the past or what the relationship with Rick is, and it's an almost impossible task in writing this kind of dialogue to make it feel super believable and natural and not forced. And honestly, there are times when this works really well and it does feel natural, because like there's a scene with Rick and Major Beale discussing the fall of civilization back at the start of the main show, and Beale is giving exposition about how certain things happened, but it felt really natural and like it was a real conversation between the two characters. But then one of the opposite examples of that is one of the earlier scenes has one of Rick's friends inside the group come up to him, and he gives this very kind of unnatural kind of dialogue where he's like, "Hey Rick, I know you. Remember 2 years in when you wouldn't talk to me and we had all of these shared experiences until finally we both became friends, and look at us now." Like I get it. They were really trying to get across the prior relationship between these two, but it does take you out a little bit because it's like, okay, but no one talks to someone they've known for 6 years like that. But honestly, there are only 2 scenes where I felt like this was really noticeable. There is one scene between one of the main CRM characters, Okafor, and it's this intense scene where he's really talking about some of the stuff that's happened to him over the years, and it's great. And then we see Andrew Lincoln bring out this whole piece that feels really, really close to like season 4 and season 5 Rick, where it's just showing you that old Rick is still in there and he might just get out, which in general, I think the clear standout of this entire episode is obviously Andrew as Rick. He plays a very different kind of Rick than we're used to. Like, it's bits of season 4, bits of season 7, bits of season 9, and then a ton of new things that he's become since ending up with the CRM. It's all really interesting. It makes it like a really filled in character that it feels like there's a lot going on underneath. Denai's Michonne isn't in too much of the episode, unfortunately, but it seems like this episode was mostly meant to catch us up on Rick, while next episode will be a lot of catching us up on Michonne. And they did do this really, really creative way of having scenes between the two characters while still keeping with the main story, which I think they probably knew people would be sad if we didn't see much of them interacting and acting from each other. So they've been a really smart way of doing that and remedying that. One thing that really surprised me about the episode were how much and how major the tie-ins to World Beyond were, but also some really cool small connections to Fear the Walking Dead that I did not expect. Like, I won't spoil anything, but in the recap at the start, for example, they show a shot from Fear when going over the CRM, but there's also a connection with one of the characters that is super small that I felt was a really cool way to bring the shows together. If anyone wants like a spoiler video, let me know, because I will do it. I will. But I know World Beyond was always meant to be essentially a prequel show to the Rick stuff. Like, I felt like the purpose of that show was building the world we see here, was bridging the gap between the main show and The Ones Who Live, but also the reviews for that show weren't great, and it felt like a lot of people who were fans of the main show had absolutely no interest in seeing World Beyond, so it felt like maybe they'd keep the tie-ins light, but like, nope. Huge moments from World Beyond are not just recapped here, but we even see some of them from the point of view of other characters, which is really cool. I guess in general, it does feel like The Ones Who Live is the shows that's connecting the franchise, because despite all these spin-offs, it feels like with the main show gone, there is no connective tissue anymore. But Fear and World Beyond have obvious tie-ins here, and then people like Scott Gimple have been teasing that there are going to be connections to Daryl and Dead City at some point after The Ones Who Live ends, so that's going to be really cool when we see what happens there. They've also sort of hinted that The Ones Who Live might not be a mini-series anymore. AMC has really changed how they're calling the show. I think they went from calling it a limited series to new series, so it feels like they might be hinting that there was going to be another season after this, which, since Daryl just got renewed for season 3 and Dead City's probably going to get a season 3 as well, it makes sense for The Ones Who Live to keep going, because I feel like this show needs to be the natural conclusion for all of these characters. Like, whether the franchise as a whole continues, for these characters, I think Rick, Michonne reuniting with everybody needs to be like the direction they get to. So you kind of need The Ones Who Live to keep going so they can get to that point, because I don't feel like Rick or Michonne just showing up on Daryl while he's over in Paris is going to work too well. But in general, I was happy with the episode. I didn't expect it to be bad though, because it's got a lot riding on it. I didn't think they would want it to be bad, or they'd let it be bad. But I'm happy to say that if you're a Rick and Michonne fan, this is probably going to be satisfying as hell. I felt it was satisfying as hell. But are you going to watch The Ones Who Live? Have you seen it already? What are your thoughts on it if you have? And if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing and all of that. And I hope you have a great day.